There have been some inventions that have changed warfare dramatically, but at the same time, some incredibly ridiculous weapons were developed throughout history. Some were just outrageous and completely useless, and some were strangely effective. So, without further ado, let's talk about the top 10 most ridiculous weapons in history. Number 10. Mayan Hornet Bomb. For a long time, the Mayan civilization was quite developed. They wielded knives, spears, clubs, bows and arrows, javelins, and all of the regular weaponry. However, they had a very interesting weapon that they had also utilized, the Hornet Bomb. Yes, they actually took hornets' nests, fitted them as bombs, and then chucked them at the enemy. They even perfected the art of throwing hornet bombs, and unsurprisingly, they were actually successful, as it would create a lot of confusion and panic. The bomb itself wasn't meant to do a lot of damage, but to break the enemy lines for the incoming attack. Number 9. Novgorod. Considered one of the worst warships ever built. Novgorod was constructed in the 1870s as a very revolutionary design at the time. It was supposed to be a coastal defense ship with a circular hull in order to reduce draught. This in turn allowed it to carry much more armor and very heavy weaponry for its size. However, it ended up being really bad. As it carried massive guns and was circular, as soon as it fired, it would just start spinning out of control, and it was very hard to get it back in order. It couldn't cope with the rough weather of the Black Sea, and it was prone to rapid rolling in pretty much anything more than a flat calm. It was offered for sale to Bulgaria in 1908, but the offer was not taken, and ultimately the ship was sold for scrap in 1911. While some say it is the worst ship ever designed, some assessments show that it was relatively effective as a coastal defense ship. Number 8. The Bat Bomb. An experimental weapon that was surprisingly successful. It was developed in the United States during World War II and was conceived by a dental surgeon, and what it was a bomb-shaped casing with thousands of compartments, each of them containing a Mexican bat with a small incendiary bomb attached to them. The idea was that they would drop the bomb at dawn, and then it would open and release the bats. In turn, these bats would fly into the attics and hard-to-reach places, and the bombs would be set on a timer. This was especially attractive to the US Army, as the Japanese utilized a lot of wood and paper constructions. The creator even said that the bats were created to await this hour in order to play a part in the scheme of free human existence. It was tested and was surprisingly very successful, as it burned down the whole mock town. However, it was way too unreliable, and the bats just scattered everywhere and even burned the commander's jeep. Still, the US considered using this, and it was only when the atomic bomb was developed that they scrapped this project that cost approximately 18 million in today's dollars. Number 7. The Davy Crockett's nuclear device. Developed in the late 1950s for the use against the Soviet and North Korean armor in case of war. It was one of the smallest nuclear weapon systems ever built, with a yield between 10 and 20 tons. Essentially, it was a portable nuke, usually operated by a 3-man crew mounted on a jeep. The weapon was never used in combat, even though it was actually a part of the United States Army. One of the biggest issues was that it would pose a threat to the actual crew, as its range was only a few miles, exposing the crew to the radiation. It also made the nuclear war more likely, as it was very widespread within the army branches. Number 6. Rocket Swords. Known as the Missourian rockets, this is an Indian weapon used in the late 18th century. As weird as they were actually successful and would be used to advance European rocketry. The Indians fitted missiles with swords and used them against the British East India Company. The swords flew some distance before coming down upon the enemy with the edge of the sword. Definitely a strange invention and surprising enough for the 18th century, but at the same time, it also played a role in the development of further weapons technology. Number 5. Bomb dogs. one of the most inhumane weapons on this list. It was mostly used by the Soviet army, but it would later be attempted by other armies as well. Initially, they were trained to leave the bomb under a tank and then return, but as that was ineffective, the dogs would be tied with the bombs. The use was widespread in 1941 and 1942, but it wasn't very efficient. It is said that 300 German tanks were damaged, but some sources are saying the actual damaged tanks were much less, even less than 100, and some even say a dozen. What made them mainly inefficient was that the Soviets trained them with their own tanks that used diesel engines, while the Germans had used gasoline ones. As the dogs relied on their sense of smell, they sought out the Soviet tanks instead. Aside from that, they would also be very scared by the tank gunfire, the noise, and would often return to their owner with the bomb. The Japanese would also utilize dogs, and even the US trained dogs to be used against fortifications, but ultimately that program failed. Luckily, as far as we know, no dogs are used today for delivering bombs. Number 4. Schwerer Gustav. Schwerer Gustav was a railway gun and the largest caliber rifle weapon ever used in combat. It was developed in the late 1930s in the preparation for the war against France, specifically designed to demolish the Maginot Line. The gun weighed 1,350 tons and fired shells weighing 7 tons at a range of 47 km. However, when the actual war started, it was not finished and the Maginot Line was bypassed anyway, so it ended up being completely useless. Finally, it would see its first use in the Battle of Sevastopol and would cause some damage, most notably destroying a munitions depot 30 meters below ground level. Why it was so ridiculous was that it took 4,000 men and 5 weeks just to get the weapon in firing position, and it took 500 men to actually fire it. It would then be moved to Leningrad, would never be used again, and ultimately it was destroyed by the Germans after the war. Probably one of the biggest overkills of World War II. Just think about how many actual weapons could have been built with all these wasted resources. Number 3. Burning pigs. Throughout history, animals had seen extensive use in warfare. However, war pigs were on a whole different level. There are records 2,000 years ago of humans using wild beasts, pigs amongst others, and releasing them towards the enemy, usually with catastrophic results as the beasts could not be controlled. However, in 272 BC, it was recorded that the Romans had used wild boars to fight elephants. Alexander the Great would also take on this practice against the elephants in India. It was said that the elephants were scared by the squeals of the pigs and therefore it would be used on many further accounts. However, more importantly, burning pigs were used with much more success. They would douse them in oil and would set them alight, driving them towards the enemy's war elephants. The elephants were so scared of the flames and the squealing that they would start trampling their own armies and would cause serious disarray. Other than that, in the 13th century, during the First Barons' War, pig fat was used to burn a fire beneath the castle, which caused the corner of a keep to collapse. King John would later raise a monument as a memorial to the pigs. Number 2. The Tsar tank. Probably one of the most ridiculous looking tanks ever. Known as the Tsar tank, it was designed in 1914 but was ultimately scrapped. What made it unique is that it didn't utilize caterpillar tracks like other tanks, but instead it had a tricycle design with 2 massive front wheels and a rear one. The wheels were absolutely immense, nearly 9 meters in diameter, with the rear wheel being only 1.5 meters. The reason for this design was in order to cross significant obstacles, which was a massive problem in trench warfare. However, with the weight being distributed very awkwardly, the rear wheel was prone to getting stuck in soft ground and ditches, and not even the 2 massive wheels could pull it out. It was also very vulnerable to artillery fire. The Tsar tank never took off and the entire project was scrapped. And lastly, number 1, LANDKREUZER P1000. Known in English as the LANDKREUZER P1000 Rat, it was a project that got close to completion but was ultimately cancelled. It was supposed to be the biggest tank ever built, larger than the Maus, which was the largest tank at the time at 188 tons. The Rat was supposed to be 1000 tons. It was planned to be 35 meters long, 11 meters high and 14 meters wide, which is completely massive. To protect this immense economic investment, it would be outfitted with 25 centimeter thick armor, several anti-aircraft guns and even naval guns were planned. The main issue was that, first of all, it would use an insane amount of fuel due to its weight, and it would literally destroy any road it would pass and would collapse most bridges. It is said that just its height alone would allow it to pass through most rivers, even without bridges, but the biggest problem was that because it was a massive weapon, it was also a massive target and was very vulnerable to aerial attacks and artillery fire. Due to just wasting resources, the project was cancelled in 1943, with Heinz Guderian saying, "Hitler's fantasies sometimes shift into the gigantic." Thank you for watching. Check out the video on what the Vikings were actually like by clicking on the screen, and also check out our Instagram page where we post facts daily. See you next time.